Welcome, history seekers, to the History Uncovered, where we bring forgotten chapters of the past back into the light of truth. Today's journey takes us into one of humanity's darkest periods as we explore the truth behind medieval witchcraft and the persecution that claimed countless lives. This is the dark truth behind medieval witchcraft, separating fact from fiction, a story of fear, power, and the tragic consequences of superstition. Stay with us until the end as we uncover the real forces that turned neighbors against neighbors and transformed entire communities into instruments of terror. First, the origins of witch beliefs in medieval Europe. The cobblestone streets of medieval towns echoed with whispers of dark forces lurking in the shadows between timber-framed houses and stone churches. In the flickering candlelight of taverns, peasants in rough wool tunics traded fearful tales of neighbors who could curse crops with a mere glance. The medieval worldview saw reality as a constant battle between divine goodness and demonic evil, with humanity caught helplessly between these cosmic forces. When crops failed or livestock died mysteriously, the medieval mind sought not natural explanations, but supernatural culprits who had betrayed God for Satan's power. The church's theologians, dressed in their black robes within monastery scriptoriums, penned elaborate treatises describing how demons could grant humans terrible powers. These learned men pored over ancient texts by candlelight, constructing theological frameworks that would justify the horrors to come in later centuries. Ancient pagan traditions still lingered in remote villages where old women gathered herbs by moonlight and murmured prayers to half-forgotten nature spirits. The church viewed these harmless folk practices as dangerous remnants of devil worship that needed to be completely eradicated from Christian society. Economic hardship swept through medieval Europe like a plague, leaving desperate people searching for someone to blame for their suffering and misfortune. In marketplaces where merchants in colorful doublets sold their wares, accusations began to spread like wildfire through communities already strained by poverty. The Black Death's devastating arrival in the 14th century killed millions and shattered the medieval world's sense of divine protection and order. Survivors wandered through villages of the dead, past abandoned cottages and silent churches, desperate to understand why God had seemingly forsaken them. Midwives and healers, often elderly women who knew the secrets of medicinal plants, became suspicious figures in communities paranoid about hidden evil. These women in their simple linen dresses and woolen shawls had once been valued neighbors, but fear transformed them into convenient scapegoats. Religious reformations and counter-reformations created theological battlegrounds where accusations of witchcraft became weapons in wars over the soul of Europe. Both Catholic and Protestant authorities, from their pulpits in grand cathedrals and simple wooden churches, preached about the urgent need to purge Satan's servants. Social outsiders, the poor widow living alone in a crumbling stone cottage, the eccentric herbalist, the foreign merchant, all became targets of suspicion. Medieval society's rigid hierarchies and intense conformity meant that anyone different could find themselves accused of congress with demons and evil spirits. Second, the accusations. Who were the accused and why? The typical accused witch was an older woman, often widowed, living alone in a modest cottage on the village outskirts with few protectors. She might be seen at dawn gathering herbs in the forest, her weathered hands selecting plants while wearing a faded dress and patched cloak. Property disputes often preceded accusations, as powerful landowners in their fine velvet robes sought legal pretexts to seize lands from vulnerable neighbors. A wealthy merchant or minor nobleman needed only to whisper "witch" to transform a property disagreement into a matter of life and death. Women who were too independent, too outspoken, or too knowledgeable about healing arts challenged medieval society's rigid expectations of female submission and silence. The midwife who had delivered half the village's children could become an accused baby killer simply for asserting her medical knowledge too confidently. Anyone who had quarreled with a neighbor before misfortune struck that household became an immediate suspect in the superstitious medieval mind. A simple argument in the village square beneath timber market stalls could be remembered years later as evidence of a curse being cast. Physical abnormalities, birthmarks, scars, unusual moles were interpreted as devil's marks, where Satan had supposedly touched his servant to seal their unholy pact. Accusers examined the bodies of terrified prisoners in cold stone chambers, searching every inch of skin for supposed proof of demonic contact. The economically vulnerable faced the greatest danger, as witch trials often served to eliminate those who depended on community charity or resources. The beggar woman asking for bread at kitchen doors, dressed in rags and extending a gnarled hand, might be accused if her request was refused. Tensions between women sometimes exploded into accusations, as domestic conflicts and jealousies found deadly outlets in the witch trial system's machinery. In the confined spaces of medieval villages where everyone knew everyone's business, petty grudges could escalate into capital charges with terrifying speed. Healers who failed to cure a patient, despite their best efforts with herbs and traditional remedies, could face accusations of deliberate poisoning. The village-wise woman returning from a failed sickbed with her basket of useless remedies might find herself arrested before reaching her own door. Communities under stress, facing plague, famine, or war, sought scapegoats to explain their suffering, and marginalized individuals provided easy, powerless targets for rage. In times of crisis, the witch became the explanation for everything wrong, a human sacrifice to restore order and divine favor. Third, the trials, methods of detection and confession. The accused was dragged from her home by men in leather jerkins and iron helmets, often at dawn, and thrown into a dark prison cell. These dungeons beneath town halls and castles were cold stone chambers lit only by torches, where rats scurried across filthy straw-covered floors. Professional witch hunters, traveling from town to town in their black cloaks, offered their services to identify and extract confessions from suspected witches. These men carried manuals describing supposed signs of witchcraft, and they profited handsomely from each conviction, creating a perverse financial incentive for finding guilt. The swimming test involved binding the accused and throwing her into a river or pond to see if the water, as God's creation, rejected her. If she floated, she was guilty and would be executed. If she sank and drowned, she was posthumously declared innocent, a cruel mockery of justice. Torture was not merely permitted, but encouraged by legal authorities who believed that confessions under extreme pain were more truthful than voluntary statements. In torchlit chambers beneath courthouses, instruments of iron and wood waited on rough tables, their purposes clear to the terrified prisoners brought before them. The strappado lifted victims by their bound wrists, dislocating shoulders, while interrogators in official robes recorded every scream as progress toward truth. Hours of this agony would break nearly anyone, and prisoners would confess to anything. Flying to Sabbaths, consorting with demons, murdering children, just to stop. Sleep deprivation was employed systematically, with guards keeping prisoners awake for days until exhaustion and hallucinations destroyed their ability to maintain coherent denials. In cold cells, shuffling guards in chainmail ensured the accused never closed her eyes, even as she swayed with fatigue and whispered desperate prayers. Accused witches were forced to name accomplices under torture, creating cascading waves of arrests that could devastate entire communities within weeks. Each name screamed out in agony became a new arrest warrant, and the machinery of persecution fed itself through extracted accusations and forced betrayals. The trials themselves were theatrical spectacles held in town squares or great halls, with judges in elaborate robes presiding over predetermined conclusions. The accused, often bruised and broken from torture, stood before crowds of former neighbors who now viewed her as a monster rather than a person. Evidence considered acceptable in witch trials would be laughable in any other legal proceeding. Hearsay, dreams, spectral visions, and confessions obtained through unbearable torture. The legal standards that protected accused criminals in other cases were completely abandoned when the charge involved supposed commerce with supernatural evil. Fourth, the executions, punishment and public spectacle. The condemned were led through streets they had walked all their lives, now lined with jeering crowds who threw stones and rotting vegetables. Dressed in white shifts meant to symbolize their spiritual corruption, these prisoners walked toward wooden platforms erected in central squares for maximum public visibility. Burning at the stake was the most common execution method, with the condemned tied to a tall wooden post surrounded by bundles of kindling. The executioner, wearing a leather hood, would light the pyre while priests in ceremonial robes offered final chances for the condemned to confess and seek mercy. Smoke rose thick and black above medieval town squares as flames consumed the accused, while crowds of townspeople in their daily dress watched in silence. Church bells tolled from stone towers, and the smell of burning flesh mixed with incense from censers swung by monks walking in solemn processions. Hanging was sometimes substituted for burning, particularly in regions where Protestant authorities followed different execution traditions than their Catholic neighbors. Wooden gallows stood on hills outside town walls, their dark silhouettes visible for miles as warnings to anyone who might stray from righteous paths. The condemned's property was typically seized by authorities, enriching both church and state while leaving families destitute and homeless on cold medieval streets. Children of executed witches became orphans shunned by communities, forced to beg or starve, carrying forever the stigma of their parents' supposed sins. Public executions served multiple purposes: punishment, deterrent, entertainment, and religious purification ritual, all combined in a single horrific spectacle of organized violence. Vendors sold food and drink to crowds watching the burnings, treating executions as festive occasions rather than the tragedies they represented for victims. Some communities executed dozens or even hundreds of accused witches in coordinated campaigns that approached genocide in their systematic thoroughness and brutal efficiency. Entire villages could see their populations decimated, with mass graves outside town walls, holding the charred remains of neighbors who had lived peacefully for decades. The bodies of the executed were often denied Christian burial, instead being left in unmarked pits or thrown into rivers to deny them rest. This final cruelty reflected the belief that witches were so corrupted by evil that even their corpses could pollute consecrated ground and water. Occasionally, the condemned would be mercifully strangled before burning began, though this mercy depended entirely on the executioner's mood and local custom variations. Even this small compassion came at a price, as families had to bribe executioners for the privilege of seeing their loved ones die slightly less painfully. Fifth, the legacy: how witch hunts changed history. The witch trials killed an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 people across Europe and colonial America, though the true number may never be precisely known. This massive loss of life devastated communities, destroyed families, and created trauma that echoed through generations in villages where neighbors had killed neighbors under color of law. The trials disproportionately targeted women, reflecting and reinforcing medieval society's deep misogyny and fear of female independence, knowledge, and sexuality beyond male control. This gendered violence taught women that stepping outside prescribed roles, healer, midwife, wise woman, could result in torture and death at community hands. Gradually, Enlightenment thinkers began questioning the witch trials' logic, asking for evidence and proof rather than accepting superstition and forced confessions as valid. In candlelit libraries and university halls, philosophers in powdered wigs and silk coats dared to suggest that perhaps demons and witches existed only in imagination. The last executions occurred in the late 18th century, though belief in witchcraft persisted far longer in rural areas isolated from Enlightenment ideas. Even as cities embraced reason and science, remote villages maintained old fears, though they no longer had legal systems willing to execute based on those fears. The witch trials demonstrated humanity's capacity for mass hysteria and the dangers of combining religious authority with state power to persecute marginalized groups. This lesson resonates through history, warning against allowing fear and superstition to override reason, evidence, and basic human compassion in legal systems. Modern scholars recognize the trials as complex phenomena involving economics, gender politics, religious conflict, and social control mechanisms rather than actual supernatural beliefs. The witch becomes a lens for understanding how societies create scapegoats during times of stress and how power structures exploit fear for control. The trauma of the witch trials influenced literature, art, and culture for centuries, inspiring works that grappled with questions of justice, faith, and persecution. From medieval woodcuts showing burning pyres to modern films, the imagery of witch hunts remains powerful in our collective cultural consciousness and memory. Some communities have formally apologized for their ancestors' role in witch trials, erecting memorials and seeking to acknowledge historical injustices committed in fear. Stone monuments now stand in town squares where women once burned, bearing names and dates as permanent reminders of what paranoia and cruelty wrought. The history of witchcraft persecution reminds us that civilization's progress is fragile, and that fear can quickly transform neighbors into executioners without constant vigilance. Our modern world, with all its supposed sophistication, must remember these lessons or risk repeating similar patterns of scapegoating and persecution against new targets. The truth about medieval witchcraft reveals not a history of supernatural evil, but a tragedy of human fear, cruelty, and injustice on a massive scale. The accused were not servants of Satan, but victims of a society that needed scapegoats for its suffering and targets for its rage. Their stories remind us of the terrible consequences when superstition replaces reason and when fear drives justice. If this journey into history's shadows has enlightened you, please show your support by liking this video, sharing your thoughts in the comments, and subscribing to The History Uncovered for more explorations of the past's hidden truths. Remember, only by understanding history's darkest chapters can we hope to build a brighter future. Thank you for watching.